Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves walking into the dim alleys of ancient Rome where the torchlight flickers against rough plaster walls and the sound of sandals echoes over stone streets that feel both alive and heavy with silence. The empire that commands continents suddenly feels small when whispers of sickness ripple through its heart. Imagine standing at the edge of the forum watching people glance nervously over their shoulders, clutching cloaks tighter around themselves as though fabric might hold back the unseen. A strange malady begins to coil its way through the crowds, and the city that once prided itself on aqueducts, marble, and military triumph now faces an enemy it cannot see. And you probably wouldn't survive long if you were unlucky enough to be the first one coughing in the market square. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating how one story can unfold across so many places at once. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins quietly with no banners unfurled, no sudden lightning bolts striking the city. People simply start to notice neighbours who fail to open their shop shutters in the morning. A baker's apprentice coughs, a merchant grows pale, and a senator slips out of meetings claiming exhaustion. Rome, at the height of its power, suddenly feels vulnerable, and no one can explain why. Unlike a barbarian horde, there is no trumpet blast announcing its arrival, no general plotting its defeat. The plague arrives without a clear beginning, which is perhaps why it frightens people more than swords ever could. The mainstream fact is that Rome had endured plagues before. Historians still argue whether this one began like the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, possibly linked to returning soldiers, or whether it was something entirely different. The quirky tidbit is that Romans, ever practical and imaginative, sometimes blamed foreign perfumes or exotic spices, as if a whiff of cinnamon could topple an empire. You can picture some poor spice trader nervously insisting that nutmeg is not contagious, while his customers slowly back away. Markets are the first to feel the tremor. People who once jostled shoulder to shoulder for figs, olives, and salted fish begin to keep a cautious distance. Hands hesitate before exchanging coins, and gossip becomes sharper than any bargain. The stall that sells garum, that fermented fish sauce so beloved by Roman cooks, suddenly empties faster, because people joke that its smell could kill, though others mutter half seriously that it might already have. 3 light jokes bloom in the streets, one that the gods are simply tired of Roman cooking, another that the city finally discovered a tax no one can escape, and a third that even the sacred chickens used for augury might refuse to peck at grain if they sense the sickness lurking. As days turn into weeks, the atmosphere thickens. Priests claim omens in the skies, perhaps a comet, perhaps an eclipse. Some citizens nod, convinced that heaven has spoken, while skeptics mutter that priests always see omens when donations are running low. Soldiers stationed near the walls find themselves wondering if guarding gates matters when the threat is invisible. A guard jokes grimly that he'd rather face a spear than a sneeze, and his comrades laugh too quickly, as though humour alone can form a shield. The Emperor's palace, with its marble corridors and gilded ceilings, cannot keep out rumour. Courtiers argue whether the illness is divine punishment, foreign trickery, or a simple turn of fate. Some whisper about poisons drifting through aqueducts, while others insist that miasmas rise from swamps. Even physicians, men trained in Galen's theories, disagree loudly, their arguments as feverish as the patients they try to treat. One prescribes bloodletting, another fumigates rooms with burning herbs, and a third throws up his hands, declaring that only the gods know the cure. Rome, the city of roads, stretching across 80,000 kilometres, feels suddenly boxed in by an enemy that moves faster than messengers on horseback. The absence of a beginning becomes its own kind of terror. If no one knows where it started, no one can predict where it will end. Each night lamps flicker in windows as families pray for dawn, wondering if sleep will carry them safely forward or quietly erase them in silence. The city's identity, its baths, its banquets, its endless chatter in taverns begins to warp under the pressure of fear. Bathhouses, once crowded with gossip and steam, grow quieter as people begin to doubt the safety of shared waters. Theatres still open, but the laughter feels brittle like pottery that might shatter with one wrong note. Even the fountains, fed by mighty aqueducts, take on an eerie cast, as though the water itself carries whispers. In the midst of this, children still play in alleys, tossing nuts like dice, their laughter, a stubborn reminder that life continues. But even their games change. Instead of chasing one another with wooden swords, they pretend to collapse, dramatically imitating stories they overhear. Parents scold them nervously, then fall silent, realizing the children are only repeating the city's deepest fear. The plague's namelessness becomes its identity. People cannot point to a wound, a single cause, a border crossed. And so the story begins with Rome unsettled, restless, and more afraid of what it cannot see than of what it knows. In the days that followed the first uneasy whispers, the streets of Rome grew restless. A fruit seller in the Forum was the first many noticed. He staggered behind his stall of figs and olives, sweat glistening on his brow, even though the day was not especially hot. By noon he collapsed his friends, rushing to carry him into the shade. At first people assumed it was simple exhaustion. After all, the markets of Rome were not known for comfort. Too much shouting, too much haggling, and let's be honest, too many people trying to sell you garum that smelled suspicious even before the lid came off. But then another man fainted near the basilica, and a boy clutching a loaf of bread shivered with fever despite the warm sun. The pattern was hard to deny. Something new was creeping into the city. The doctors, or at least those who styled themselves physicians, had few answers. They took pulses, they peered at tongues, they shook their heads gravely and muttered about imbalances of humours. Some recommended warm baths, others cold. A few suggested that garlic boiled in vinegar would ward off the affliction, though one wonders if that was genuine advice, or just an excuse to keep patients at a safe, smelly distance. The truth was that Rome's medical knowledge, though impressive for its time, had no real weapon against sudden fevers. One mainstream fact worth remembering is that Roman physicians often relied on Greek teachings, especially those of Galen, who emphasized observation and balance. Yet when confronted with sickness that moved invisibly through crowds, observation only confirmed helplessness. Meanwhile, rumours ran faster than the couriers who dashed along Rome's famous roads. Some swore the sickness had begun in the Subura district, that tangled warren of narrow alleys, where taverns and brothels thrived. Others claimed it had arrived on ships from Alexandria, tucked inside sacks of grain, or the lungs of sailors. One story even insisted the plague was punishment for an insult the emperor had made to Jupiter himself, though the exact insult seemed to change with every retelling. Historians still argue whether the origins of this particular outbreak were rooted in actual trade routes, or simply in the Roman tendency to blame foreigners and the gods interchangeably. Merchants, ever practical, worried less about the gods and more about the purse. If the sickness touched the docks, shipments could falter. Already a shipment of Spanish olive oil was delayed when its crew fell ill, and a caravan from Gaul hesitated outside the city, unsure whether to unload goods in what now seemed a dangerous marketplace. Imagine the frustration of traders who had marched for weeks with wagons, only to be told that Rome's streets might be more perilous than the brigands along the roads. And here's a small joke for you: if merchants could profit from gossip, the plague would have made them richer than Caesar himself. Inside the city, daily routines faltered. Crowds still gathered in the Forum, but voices grew hushed. Citizens eyed each other warily, as though every cough might be the herald of doom. Bakers wore cloths over their mouths, not because they truly believed it worked, but because customers were more willing to buy bread from a man who at least looked cautious. Bathhouses, once loud with chatter, grew quieter. The water still steaming, but fewer patrons willing to risk close company. Even the great Circus Maximus, where tens of thousands usually gathered for chariot races, saw dwindling audiences. Rome without a crowd felt unnatural, as if the city's very identity were unravelling. The first official notices went out quietly. Messengers nailed wax tablets to the doors of temples, instructing citizens to pray for deliverance and to avoid unnecessary gatherings. Of course, unnecessary is a word open to interpretation. A senator might consider his evening banquet necessary, especially if it involved oysters from Campania and a fresh batch of Falernian wine. Ordinary citizens, however, were told to keep to their households. It did not help that most Roman households were small apartments stacked in insulae where close living made isolation laughable. Quirky tidbit: some landlords tried to raise rents even during the sickness, arguing that scarcity of safe spaces justified higher prices. If you ever think modern landlords are creative, the Romans set a pretty high bar. As more cases appeared, panic became a companion on every street. Families dragged sick relatives to temples, begging priests to intercede. Herbalists sold concoctions that promised protection, ranging from ground bay leaves to concoctions involving wine mixed with ashes. None worked, though many drank them anyway. Street performers turned dark, reciting rhymes about invisible spirits who walk the alleys at night. Children listened wide-eyed, repeating the lines as games until the games turned too real when one of their own fell ill. Through it all, the Emperor remained strangely silent. Perhaps he hoped the sickness would pass like a sudden storm clearing on its own, or perhaps he feared that admitting weakness would invite unrest. Rome's history was full of moments when disaster toppled more than bodies, it toppled rulers. One mainstream fact is that during the Antonine Plague centuries later, Marcus Aurelius struggled to balance war and disease, showing how vulnerable even the strongest empire could be. Whether this earlier plague mirrored that disaster, or stood as a separate mystery, the uncertainty gnawed at everyone from senators to slaves. The city's heartbeat, usually steady and loud, faltered. Citizens whispered prayers as they passed shrines touching the marble bases for luck. Market stalls closed earlier. Taverns that once rang with laughter turned quiet, save for the occasional cough. Fear, it seemed, was as contagious as the illness itself. Historians still argue whether these early symptoms were the beginning of a great plague or merely one of the countless epidemics that swept ancient cities. What remains clear is how quickly daily life in Rome could unravel when faced with an unseen enemy. And so, the stage was set. Rome, the eternal city, unsettled not by a visible foe with swords and banners, but by something quieter, smaller, and far more insidious. The fever crept through streets, clinging to breath and shadow, reminding everyone that even the mightiest empire could stumble when faced with mysteries it could not see. As the sickness tightened its grip, the city began to notice not only the growing numbers of the ill, but also the strange patterns that accompanied the spread. Some districts seemed untouched, their families carrying on with daily chores, as though nothing unusual had entered Rome at all. In others, entire insulae of apartments emptied almost overnight, the doors barred, the windows shuttered, silence falling, where only yesterday there had been laughter and quarrels. Citizens began to whisper that the plague moved like a shadow, choosing some streets while sparing others, as though guided by a hand unseen. Superstition thrived in this uncertainty. People threw salt across thresholds, burned rosemary at dawn, and muttered charms against spirits. Whether these rituals provided comfort or simply filled the unbearable silence hardly mattered. They gave Romans the illusion that they were doing something to resist. One mainstream fact worth recalling is that Romans believed strongly in the link between air and illness. The miasma theory that foul odours carried sickness was accepted across the empire. So when the sweet stench of garum or the smoke of countless oil lamps seemed to thicken, people pinched their noses and muttered that bad air was surely to blame. To counter it, they swung censers of incense through hallways, sprinkled vinegar on floors, and opened shutters to let in the breeze. Did it help? Not likely. But at least the houses smelled slightly less like yesterday's fish sauce, which might be considered an improvement in its own right. The religious authorities seized the moment. Priests declared that sacrifices must be made to appease the gods, and processions wound through the streets carrying statues of Jupiter, Apollo, and Minerva. Temples overflowed with offerings, garlands of flowers, amphorae of wine coins scattered across marble altars. A quirky tidbit comes from later chroniclers who claim that some desperate citizens even sacrificed mice, believing the small creatures carried away illness, when burned, a rather pungent strategy that likely drove away neighbours more effectively than disease. Historians still argue whether such sacrifices were official rites, or merely the improvisations of a frightened population, but the detail lingers in the patchwork of sources. Meanwhile, the army stationed near the city grew uneasy. Soldiers were accustomed to enemies they could see and stab not foes that slipped invisibly into their ranks. Reports surfaced of entire barracks falling ill. Their drills disrupted, their once bright armour left to dull in corners. Commanders fretted that if the plague weakened, the garrison enemies beyond Rome's walls might sense weakness. A city so mighty with legions stretched across continents trembled at the thought that invisible fevers might succeed where barbarian invasions had failed. One officer joked bitterly that at least barbarians had the courtesy to shout before they struck. This new foe preferred whispers. Daily routines shifted in unsettling ways. Markets once bursting with voices became hesitant gatherings. The forum still rang with business, but transactions were brisk words, clipped eyes, darting as if to measure the health of one's partners. Bakers sold loaves through doorways rather than inviting customers inside. Tavern keepers set cups down at arm's length, unwilling to linger too close to patrons. Even the great baths, normally crowded with citizens gossiping and scheming, now echoed with emptiness. A bather might find himself alone in a vast hall, the water steaming but silence thicker than the mist. Rome was a city built on noise, and in these quieter days the silence itself seemed accusatory. The wealthy, ever resourceful, attempted their own defences. Some fled to country villas, claiming fresh air and distance from crowds would preserve them. Others ordered servants to burn exotic resins or to hang amulets of amber and jet in doorways. One senator was rumoured to have lined his entire dining room with laurel branches, believing the plant sacred to Apollo would repel sickness. Did these measures work? Not in the slightest, but they did provide excellent conversation material, which in Roman society was almost as important as medicine. The poor had fewer choices. They could not flee. Their lives were bound to the crowded apartments and narrow alleys of the city. For them, survival meant improvisation. Some fashioned crude masks from scraps of cloth, others carried sprigs of herbs beneath their noses. Children were told to avoid strangers, though in the maze of Roman streets that instruction was as impossible to enforce as telling pigeons not to roost on statues. Quirky stories circulated of men sleeping with garlic cloves tied around their necks, a practice that made them repulsive to illness and to everyone else within a 5-metre radius. Amidst all this, debate swirled. Was the sickness a punishment for neglecting old gods, or for embracing new ones? Rome was after all a collector of cults, Mithras in underground chambers, Isis worshipped in imported temples, Christian gatherings whispered in secret corners. Each faction pointed fingers at the others, declaring that the wrath of heaven was surely provoked by someone else's rituals. Historians still argue whether this plague accelerated religious tensions in Rome, but it certainly gave people excuses to sharpen their suspicions. Messages from the provinces brought no comfort. Couriers reported cases in nearby towns, suggesting the plague was not confined to Rome alone. Villages along the Tiber fell silent. Their markets abandoned their shrines, crowded with anxious prayers. The roads, once so full of carts and travellers, carried fewer and fewer souls, as though the arteries of the empire were hardening. Merchants complained that even their mules looked nervous, though whether animals could sense the sickness or simply mirrored their master's unease remains unclear. The emperor finally addressed the crisis, though not with clarity. Edicts proclaimed that citizens must honour the gods, avoid unnecessary gatherings and maintain calm. As if calm could be commanded by decree, the words were read aloud in forums and inscribed on tablets, but most citizens muttered that what they wanted was not piety but answers. A joke drifted through the streets. "The gods will protect us," one citizen said. "Yes," replied another as soon as the Senate votes them a proper stipend. As days turned to weeks, one truth became inescapable: the plague was not fleeting. It lingered untraceable and unexplained, sowing dread as effectively as it sowed fever. Rome, the city that had outlasted sieges and fires, now found itself wrestling with a foe that left no clear mark. The absence of certainty proved as heavy as the sickness itself. Citizens went to sleep wondering if they would wake. They rose each morning wondering how many others had not. In this atmosphere of dread and improvisation, life carried on, but always with a trembling undertone. Priests burned incense, doctors prescribed herbs, merchants adjusted prices, and families whispered prayers into the night. Yet the mystery remained intact. Where had the plague come from? And why had it chosen this moment to descend on Rome? Without those answers, the empire stumbled forward in uncertainty, its grandeur haunted by the silence of unanswered questions. The plague crept deeper into the rhythms of the empire, and soon it was not just a handful of neighbourhoods that trembled, but the entire capital. Word of the emperor's edict spread, carried by heralds with scrolls in hand, but their voices rang thin against the coughs echoing in courtyards. Even the marble temples, normally thrumming with ritual confidence, seemed subdued, their altars crowded with more desperate offerings than ever before. When a city begins to measure its health, not by the sound of laughter in taverns, but by the number of incense sticks smouldering in prayer, you know something profound has shifted. Rome, which prided itself on order and resilience, now bent beneath the weight of invisible fear. One mainstream fact comes into focus here: Rome had weathered epidemics before. The city's density, its constant flow of trade, and its fondness for public gathering made it fertile ground for disease. Records speak of earlier outbreaks that felled soldiers and citizens alike, yet none left such a puzzle of origins as this one. Unlike the Antonine Plague or later waves of pestilence, this event carried no clear beginning. There was no patient zero to blame, no exotic caravan or unlucky ship to point to with conviction. Instead, the sickness seemed to arrive all at once, as if Rome itself had breathed in a curse. Historians still argue whether this lack of origin reflects a true mystery, or whether the evidence simply dissolved across centuries, leaving only silence where a story should have been. The city's economy began to wobble. Grain ships wary of docking delayed their deliveries. Farmers in the countryside hesitated to send produce, fearful that the city was cursed and that their goods might carry misfortune back with them. A quirky tidbit from a later account even insists that one farmer painted protective symbols on every sack of grain, hoping to convince buyers that his harvest was plague-proof. Whether or not his marketing strategy worked, the anecdote reveals the strange ways desperation twisted commerce. Inside the city, bread grew scarce, and when bread grows scarce in Rome, tempers rise faster than the temperature of an overheated bathhouse. The army, meanwhile, faced a crisis of confidence. Legions were the backbone of Rome's power, and the sight of soldiers falling ill unnerved both citizens and commanders. Training exercises halted patrols thinned, and officers muttered darkly about what might happen if enemies beyond the frontier sensed weakness. Imagine the irony: men who had survived campaigns in Germania or Parthia, who had carried 30 kilograms, about 66 pounds of gear, for 20 kilometres, about 12 miles a day, now brought low by something invisible, something that could not be stabbed with a gladius. One soldier was overheard saying, "Give me barbarians any day. At least they don't sneak into your lungs while you sleep." That earned him a few weary chuckles, because even in fear, Romans clung to humour like a shield. In homes across the city, the plague rewrote family life. Parents kept children indoors, though in crowded insulae that meant boredom, not safety. Some families hung herbs over doorways, others painted charms on walls, still others relied on whispered prayers to ancestors. The poor, lacking options, often gathered around small shrines, lighting oil lamps that burned only 100 millilitres, about 3.5 fluid ounces of oil at a time, short flames, short hopes. Wealthier families retreated into their villas, entertaining themselves with private feasts and readings from scrolls. But even there, servants moved cautiously, cupbearers trembling as they poured wine, cooks second-guessing every spice. The sense that anyone could be guilty, anyone could be the source, eroded trust within walls that once felt secure. Public entertainment faltered. The theatres grew quiet. The gladiatorial games postponed. The Circus Maximus, where chariots once thundered and crowds roared, now stood eerily silent. A mainstream fact, Rome's games were often political tools designed to distract citizens from hardship. When the games stopped, citizens noticed the hardship more sharply. Without races to cheer or plays to watch, they turned their attention inward, and inward attention in a city of suspicion was rarely healthy. Rumours multiplied faster than pigeons in the forum. Temples became more theatrical in their attempts to reassure. Priests sacrificed oxen, sheep, and even doves, their entrails examined for omens. Crowds pressed close, eager for meaning. Some swore they saw signs of divine displeasure, blemishes on livers, strange patterns in smoke cracks in altar stones. Others smirked and muttered that priests saw whatever kept the offerings flowing. A joke circulated. The gods are generous. They take our coins, our oxen, and now our emperor too. Nervous laughter followed, for in Rome jokes were often daggers wrapped in cloth. Beyond the walls, travellers spread the story further. Merchants carried rumours along roads that stretched 80,000 kilometres, about 50,000 miles, whispering of Rome's sickness to villages and towns far from the capital. Some accounts suggest nearby provinces closed their gates to Roman caravans, fearing contamination. A quirky story tells of one town that demanded Roman traders wash in vinegar baths before entering an early form of sanitation that probably stung more than it saved. Historians still argue whether the plague truly radiated outward from Rome, or whether scattered outbreaks occurred independently, but to the people of the empire it all felt like one great shadow creeping across the world. In the Senate, debates turned heated. Some senators argued for stricter quarantines, though no one quite knew how to enforce them in a city so dense. Others demanded larger sacrifices, pointing fingers at rivals who supposedly failed to honour the gods properly. A few suggested building new shrines altogether, as if fresh marble could bribe heaven. But underneath the speeches lay fear of blame, fear of loss, fear of losing power. Rome's political theatre never paused even in crisis, though the stage was emptier than usual, with many senators absent either from illness or from convenient retreats to country estates. And all the while, ordinary Romans carried on as best they could. They still bought bread when they could find it, still fetched water from aqueduct-fed fountains, still mended tunics and sandals. Life in Rome was too large to stop entirely, but it ran at a slower pace, heavy with unease. Citizens wondered aloud how long the sickness would last and whether they would ever know where it began. Without a starting point, the plague felt eternal, like a shadow that had always been part of the city's stones. By now, the plague had become not just a medical mystery, but a cultural one. It revealed cracks in faith, in politics, in family and commerce. Rome could still boast its monuments, its aqueducts, its legions, but none of those could explain why an emperor might die without a mark, or why citizens fell ill without warning. And in the absence of explanation, the city leaned into what it did best, telling stories, weaving rumours and filling silence with noise. Except this time the noise was muted, cautious, carried in whispers that flitted through marble corridors like ghosts. The plague, still without a clear beginning, pressed harder against the boundaries of Rome's confidence. By this point the city's rituals had grown louder, even as its spirit dimmed. Priests shouted invocations in crowded temples, processions wound through the streets and sacrifices piled high on altars. Yet for all the incense and blood and hymns, the sickness kept its quiet rhythm. Rome, which once believed it could bend the gods with ceremonies, now began to wonder if perhaps the gods were covering their ears. Citizens whispered that no amount of laurel garlands could sweeten the air, and no amphora of wine poured on marble could quench divine anger. One mainstream fact from Roman life surfaces here: the city had a long tradition of interpreting omens in every tremor of nature. When a raven perched too long on the rostrum, it was said to be delivering judgment. When lightning struck a tree, augurs read it as a celestial warning. So it was inevitable that the plague would be wrapped in the language of signs. Priests of Apollo pointed to sudden weather changes, claiming that storms announced divine wrath. Haruspices sliced open animals and studied their livers, reporting blemishes that only they seemed able to see. The people nodded, uncertain whether to believe, but grateful at least to hear someone pretending to have answers. Historians still argue whether these rituals were sincerely believed or cynically performed, but the impact on daily life was undeniable. The city's rhythm continued to unravel. Theatres remained closed, their stages dusty masks hanging unused. Gladiators sat idle, sharpening swords that would not see the arena. Even charioteers, normally loud and brash, walked the streets, subdued their fame, paling beside the shadow of fever. Ordinary citizens missed the games, not simply for spectacle, but because they offered distraction. A quirky tidbit some storytellers took to improvising miniature dramas in alleys, acting out tales of gods and heroes to keep spirits afloat. One wag even joked that if the plague lingered, Rome would forget how to cheer properly, and the next chariot race would sound like a funeral. Merchants adapted with characteristic creativity. Lacking grain from Spain and oil from Africa, they turned to substitutes, though not always welcome ones. Bread grew coarser, wine, weaker, oil, rarer. Citizens muttered that their daily meals tasted like exile, as though Rome itself had been banished from plenty. Some tried trading amulets instead of food, promising charms that would ward off the sickness. Small figurines of gods carved hastily from cheap clay appeared in marketplaces. People bought them not because they trusted them, but because fear is persuasive and a charm is lighter to carry than doubt. The plague also deepened cracks within households. Suspicion spread more easily than fever. Servants were eyed with mistrust, especially those who handled food or wine. Families argued over whether to let outsiders into their homes, even long-trusted friends. Cupbearers once honoured for their closeness to masters now trembled as they lifted jugs. Every pore watched with hawk-like eyes. A mainstream fact of Roman dining customs highlights this tension. Feasts were central to political and social life. Yet in this season of sickness, banquets shrank, guests declined invitations, and the clatter of shared meals quieted into awkward solitude. Soldiers too adapted to the new reality. Barracks introduced rules that sounded suspiciously like early quarantine: no one entered without inspection, no one left without reason. Soldiers joked grimly that they were now prisoners guarding themselves, yet discipline held. The legions, even weakened, understood that order was their survival. Still morale sagged. A quirky anecdote tells of one cohort that insisted on carrying garlic bulbs on campaign, tying them to standards as talismans. Did it work? Certainly not against disease, but it did make their standard smell distinctive enough to keep rival cohorts at a respectful distance. The city's poor suffered most. Crowded apartments became breeding grounds. Families crammed into small rooms with little ventilation. Water carried in clay jugs from public fountains could not wash away fear. Some households pooled resources, sharing what bread and wine they had left. Others, desperate, turned to theft. Records speak of small riots in markets, where scarcity drove citizens to snatch food and flee. The guards struggled to contain unrest, their presence adding tension rather than reassurance. A joke drifted through the poorer quarters. At least when the plague comes, you don't have to pay rent. Dark humour, yes, but in fear, laughter becomes its own medicine. Meanwhile, whispers of politics swirled like smoke. Some senators accused rivals of neglecting proper rituals, insisting that personal failings had brought divine punishment. Others murmured that the plague was a convenient excuse for the emperor to tighten control, limiting assemblies and silencing dissent. Historians still argue whether political manipulation deepened the crisis, or whether the sickness was simply too overwhelming to be used so neatly. What is clear is that suspicion turned every faction against the others. The Senate blamed the priests blamed the emperor blamed fate, and the people blamed everyone in sight. Foreigners in the city faced particular suspicion. Traders from the east were accused of bringing cursed goods. African merchants were whispered to carry tainted spices. Egyptian cults became easy scapegoats, their exotic rituals framed as dangerous to Rome's order. One mainstream fact of Roman religion is its openness. Rome famously adopted gods from other lands, but in times of fear, openness curdled into paranoia. A quirky tidbit, some claimed that a single ibis bird sacred to Egypt had been seen flying over the Tiber at night, and this was taken as proof of a curse. Whether or not the bird even existed, the rumour spread faster than any courier. Daily life became a balancing act between despair and stubborn continuity. Farmers still drove carts into the city, though with fewer goods. Bakers still kneaded dough, though with rougher flour. Children still played, though their games increasingly mimicked the sickness. One child would pretend to collapse the others, deciding who among them was the poisoner. Rome was resilient, but resilience is not the same as certainty. The mystery of the plague's beginning, its refusal to name itself, gnawed at the empire like a rat at grain stores. The emperor, under pressure, ordered fresh sacrifices and proclaimed public prayers. Yet citizens noticed that his own family had retreated behind palace walls, their seclusion a poor contrast to their calls for shared piety. Cynicism sharpened. A joke reached the streets. The emperor prays with us through his locked doors. It was not openly treasonous, but it carried the sting of truth. Faith in leadership faltered, and faith in explanations grew thinner by the day. By the end of this stage, Rome was not collapsing, but it was trembling. The plague had woven itself into every layer of life, faith, food, family politics. And still, no origin appeared, no answer to the haunting question of where it had begun. A city that prided itself on conquering others could not even conquer the mystery within its own walls. The centuries move on, and the empire does what empires do. It breaks, bends, reforms, and tries to convince itself that the cracks are simply character lines. Yet the strange plague that once seemed to appear without warning continues to haunt the imagination of those who live under Rome's shadow. Writers, priests, and politicians alike cannot resist turning the outbreak into a story that suits their own agendas. By now the details have blurred. Was it a fever? A wasting cough? A sudden rash that seemed to leap from skin to skin like wildfire? The chroniclers of later years do not agree, but each insist that their version carries weight. This muddle of contradictions makes the plague more ghost than fact, a riddle that everyone repeats but no one can fully solve. A mainstream historical fact emerges here: in the 2nd century, Rome truly did suffer the Antonine Plague, which killed hundreds of thousands. That plague is usually blamed on smallpox or measles. Yet in the retelling of our nameless outbreak, the specifics slide like sand between fingers. Some scholars argue that later Romans folded together multiple calamities, famines, earthquakes, illnesses, into one sprawling tale. In this view, the mysterious epidemic is not a single event at all, but a composite shadow of many misfortunes. Historians still argue whether that explains the confusion, or whether there really was a separate earlier pestilence that has now dissolved into myth. Imagine a senator pacing his marble atrium, dictating to a scribe. He insists that the emperor's health failed because of divine wrath, not invisible contagion. His reasoning: a comet had blazed across the sky not long before, and everyone knows comets never appear just to brighten the night. To the senator, the heavens themselves testify, so why waste ink describing boils or fevers when one blazing omen can carry the story? His scribe dutifully scratches on the wax tablet, perhaps rolling his eyes where no one can see. A fringe tidbit preserved in certain commentaries suggests that some scribes slipped in their own snide asides, knowing that centuries later readers might stumble on their small rebellions in the margins. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans are not poring over scrolls, they are living the fear in courtyards, markets and taverns. A baker in a russet tunic shakes his head, telling anyone who will listen that the flour itself must be cursed, for he has never seen so many neighbours sicken at once. A water seller insists the Tiber carries a dark influence, and he points to floating reeds as proof. These explanations may not satisfy physicians, but they do help frightened people wrestle their dread into something they can name. Humans, whether in the 1st century or the 21st, have a talent for assigning blame where evidence is thinnest. The whisper of foreign sorcery rises again. Traders from Parthia or Egypt are accused of carrying powders and charms, deliberately seeding illness to weaken the empire. The idea makes political sense. If Rome cannot guard its own capital, how can it hope to subdue distant provinces? To add spice to the suspicion, storytellers describe cloaked strangers scattering ashes at crossroads, their faces hidden, their gestures ominous. Whether these were real figures or just bogeymen invented to keep children indoors, we cannot know. The detail itself, however, shows how quickly the epidemic stretched beyond medicine into legend. Let us pause for a light joke, since even amidst pestilence, people cling to humour. Imagine a tavern singer strumming his lyre half drunk, declaring that the gods have finally taken up hygiene and decided to cleanse the city one sneeze at a time. The patrons groan not only at the grim implication but at the weak punchline. One mutters that if divine justice truly required that much sneezing, half the city would already be saints. Back in the palaces, politics chews on the epidemic like a dog on a bone. Advisors debate whether to announce that the emperor has offered sacrifices to end the plague, or whether to downplay the whole affair. Some urge a show of strength, procession of priests incense thick enough to choke the fear out of the streets, and public declarations that Rome will not bend. Others argue that such displays only confirm the crisis. This delicate dance between silence and spectacle repeats whenever disaster threatens, proving that public relations is older than marble itself. Quirky anecdotes crop up in the archaeological record too. In one ruined villa, a graffito shows a stick figure with arms outstretched, above which someone carved the words, "I lived, you did not." Was it a cruel survivor's boast, or a gallows human memorial scratched after the plague passed? No one can say. Yet its existence suggests that ordinary people processed catastrophe through crude art as well as through prayer. It is an echo across centuries, faint but oddly familiar. Doctors, or those claiming the title, experiment with remedies. One prescribes vinegar mixed with crushed roses, promising that the fragrance alone will drive off the foul air. Another recommends burning pine resin in every chamber, though neighbours complain it makes the house smell like a carpenter's workshop. A third insists on goat's milk baths, which would at least distract sufferers with their sheer absurdity. Modern readers may laugh, but the logic is not far from some wellness fads that still thrive today. Historians still argue whether such prescriptions were genuinely attempted in the epidemic we describe, or whether later writers simply imported the recipes from other outbreaks. Here is another moment for gentle sarcasm. Picture a Roman farmer being told to boil his water before drinking. He nods gravely, then goes home and pours it straight from the cistern, deciding the gods prefer their sacrifices raw. If nothing else, this shows how deep-seated human stubbornness can be. Practical measures are sometimes harder to spread than the plague itself. The contradictions accumulate. Some chroniclers describe streets so silent that even dogs stopped barking. Others claim that the same days saw crowds flocking to temples, filling the air with hymns and incense. Both cannot be true in the same place at the same time, yet both survive in text, copied and recopied by monks who cared less about consistency than about preserving any scrap at all. The result is a mosaic of half-memories and anxious embroidery, leaving modern scholars to puzzle, like archaeologists with only shards of pottery. And so the emperor's mysterious illness, whether real or magnified, mutates into story as surely as any virus mutates in flesh. It becomes a stage on which everyone from senator to slave acts out their fears, their hopes and their politics. The more time passes, the less the plague resembles medicine and the more it resembles theatre. Its script is rewritten, with every retelling ensuring that no cure can ever be final, because the sickness now lives in imagination rather than in lungs. The city is weary now, though it pretends otherwise. The plague that Rome never fully named still drifts through its alleys like a rumour given flesh. People wake in the morning unsure if the scratch in their throat is harmless, dust from the forum or the first whisper of something that could carry them away. At midday, shopkeepers still open their shutters, laying out bolts of saffron-dyed cloth or wicker baskets filled with olives, yet they keep one eye on the customers who cough too often. By evening, the taverns fill as usual, wine poured in clay cups and jokes exchanged about senators who cannot agree on anything, but beneath the laughter is a nervous edge. The city wants to be strong, to look like marble and bronze, but marble cracks and bronze tarnishes. Rome knows this, and still it hopes. One mainstream fact grounds the tension. Ancient Rome is no stranger to pestilence. Earlier outbreaks like the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century killed vast numbers and reshaped the empire's economy. Citizens remember these stories even generations later. Every cough in the present reminds them of entire legions that once vanished to illness, leaving borders weak. The memory lingers like a bruise pressed again and again. The soldiers in their camps feel it too. They march their 25 kilometres, about 15 miles each day, carrying nearly 30 kilograms, about 66 pounds of gear, but their real burden is invisible. Who trusts comrades when fever could strike overnight? Officers attempt to keep discipline, shouting about loyalty and honour, yet they also quietly post lists of the sick noting names with a scratch of charcoal on wooden tablets. In that silence between commands, the men stare at one another, wondering which face might be gone by dawn. A soldier once joked that he feared dice games more than barbarian spears. Now he mutters that he fears sneezes more than swords. In the palaces, senators gather with guarded expressions. Their togas of indigo and russet shimmer faintly in lamplight, and their speeches sound strong on the surface. They talk of roads that must be built, aqueducts that must be repaired, markets that must be regulated. But everyone in the chamber is thinking about the one question nobody names aloud: what if the emperor himself has been touched by the mystery illness? Historians still argue whether the plague ever reached the heart of the ruling family, yet the fear of it is enough to twist politics into knots. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans improvise remedies. They burn herbs like rosemary and thyme, hoping the smoke itself carries protection. Street vendors sell amulets carved from bone or bronze, promising safety against invisible foes. One fringe tidbit insists that crocodile dung mixed with honey applied to the skin wards off evil humours. Nobody wants to test it seriously, but in desperate times, even the absurd earns customers. A woman in a saffron shawl tells her neighbour that she has sprinkled powdered emerald into her wine. After all, if the gems adorn crowns, why not guard stomachs too? The logic is flimsy, the practice expensive, but the desperation is real. Priests wander the streets swinging censers heavy with incense. The smoke curls above the crowd, gilded in lamplight, and people murmur prayers that sound more like bargains. "Protect my son, and I will bring a goat," one man whispers. "Spare my daughter, and I will clean the temple steps," promises another. The priests nod solemnly, but they know as well as anyone that promises often outlast results. Still, faith offers structure in a time when the plague does not. Children notice the changes even more sharply. They play in courtyards, chasing each other with sticks that they pretend are swords, yet their games now include sudden collapses. One child falls dramatically, announcing he has caught the Emperor's curse, and the others laugh, half delighted, half uneasy. Through play, they echo the fears of their parents, turning them into entertainment. The streets echo with their voices shrill but nervous. If children repeat the rumour often enough, it becomes its own form of memory. The household slaves carry their burdens quietly. They scrub the mosaic floors, polish. Bronze statues fetch water in wooden buckets, and try not to breathe too deeply when they are close to their masters. They have little choice. A sick slave is often abandoned outside the city walls, left for fate. Some manage to escape into the countryside, hoping the open air is kinder than crowded alleys. Others remain their loyalty mingled with necessity, whispering among themselves at night about which families treat them with compassion and which will cast them out. Markets change subtly under the shadow of disease. Fishmongers in teal tunics slap their wares on stone counters, but buyers hesitate, sniffing too carefully. Bakers offer loaves studded with poppy seeds, yet customers ask if the grain came from safe farms or tainted ones. Prices fluctuate not because of supply, but because of fear. One quirky report describes how figs from a certain orchard sold better, simply because a rumour claimed the trees were blessed by the gods. Superstition becomes currency as real as denarii. At night, the city looks deceptively calm. Oil lamps flicker on balconies, dogs bark in distant courtyards, and the Tiber flows steady beneath its bridges. Yet behind shuttered windows, families huddle close, whispering about neighbours who disappeared, about funerals too quiet, about smoke rising from pyres outside the gates. The absence of public mourning is itself eerie. Romans are known for spectacle for public display, and yet the plague silences even grief. Citizens wonder if silence itself is contagious. The emperor's shadow lingers over all of it. His markless death has become the standard against which every unexplained illness is measured. Did this man die naturally, or is he another victim of the same unseen force no one knows? The uncertainty feeds the imagination more than certainty ever could. A senator suggests one explanation, a general prefers another, a slave offers a rumour of curses. The truth hides behind all of it, refusing to show its face. Still, life continues. Bread is baked, speeches delivered, soldiers, march lovers meet in shadowed alleys. Rome refuses to pause even when every cough feels like a dice roll, and in that refusal lies both its strength and its danger. The city clings to routine as if routine could banish death, but routine also spreads the plague faster. Historians still argue whether this stubbornness preserved Rome or hastened its suffering, so the city goes on half defiant, half trembling. Somewhere in a tavern, someone cracks a joke that perhaps the gods have grown tired of human prayers and now demand silence instead. The laughter that follows is sharp, almost desperate, but it is laughter nonetheless. Rome endures not by solving the mystery, but by weaving it into its daily rhythm. The plague that stalks the empire does not remain confined to the bustling heart of Rome. Like a restless traveller, it moves outward along the arteries of roads, rivers and sea routes that bind provinces together. Caravans trudge over dusty stones, carrying amphorae of oil and sacks of grain, but they also carry invisible seeds of sickness tucked away in coughs and fevers. Ships bobbing across the Mediterranean deliver spices, cloth and silver, and yet their greatest cargo is silence, the silence of men who fall ill in foreign harbours. The empire that prides itself on connection discovers that connection can be as dangerous as it is profitable. One merchant jokes that Rome should have taxed the plague since it travels more diligently than any customs officer. Another mutters that perhaps Neptune himself is smuggling it aboard ships as punishment for unpaid sacrifices. In Alexandria, scholars peer from the library's marble steps and shake their heads at the odd timing. How could a sickness appear with no clear origin yet settle with such precision on the city's docks? The grain fleets that feed Rome rely on these waters, and now every sack of wheat looks like a potential coffin. Meanwhile in Antioch, priests whisper that foreign cults might have stirred divine wrath. Citizens eye traders from far-off lands with suspicion, forgetting that yesterday those same traders brought perfumes and gems that delighted them. It is one of history's familiar patterns: when fear surges, foreigners become convenient culprits. Historians still argue whether outbreaks in these provinces truly began with external arrivals, or whether locals blamed outsiders simply because blame feels more comfortable than uncertainty. By the time legions march back from distant campaigns, the sickness marches with them. Soldiers who once believed their shields could stop anything discover that armour is useless against a fever. They cough in tight tents, share water skins, and bury comrades under cairns of stone before resuming the march. Some commanders attempt to enforce isolation, placing the sick in separate camps, but the result is only 2 camps filled with illness instead of 1. A fringe tidbit emerges from a letter found centuries later. A centurion weary of funerals supposedly declared that Mars had abandoned his soldiers and left them to Pluto's bookkeeping. Scholars doubt the letter's authenticity, but it captures the raw despair that likely spread as fast as the sickness itself. Along the northern frontiers, villages see Roman troops arriving with weakened numbers and trembling limbs. Farmers watch nervously as these men request shelter, unsure whether to refuse an imperial order or risk contagion. Some dig shallow trenches to bury victims, while others set torches to infected huts, hoping fire will succeed where medicine fails. The smell of smoke and sickness mixes with pine forests, leaving memories that cling long after the flames die down. A mainstream historical fact reminds us that Roman military roads stretched over 80,000 kilometres, making the empire's reach extraordinary. Yet those same roads become highways for the plague, turning logistical genius into lethal exposure. Markets across provinces respond in curious ways. In Hispania, prices of garlic triple overnight because rumour declares it a protective charm. In Gaul, innkeepers refuse travellers unless they carry amulets blessed by local druids. In Egypt, sellers of incense double their profits, claiming certain resins purify the air. One humorist scribbles graffiti declaring that the plague must be allergic to high prices. Otherwise, why would merchants grow so healthy? The joke lands poorly with those counting their coins for dwindling food. Still, humour serves as a frail lantern against the dark, and laughter, even nervous, is easier than silence. Not all reactions are hostile. In Cappadocia, neighbours carry water to afflicted households, convinced that kindness will shield them better than charms. In Cyrene, records speak of citizens pooling money to fund communal burials, sparing families from ruin. These glimpses remind us that solidarity can flicker even in crisis, though historians still argue whether such examples were widespread or merely hopeful exceptions preserved by sympathetic chroniclers. Rome's empire contains multitudes, and human responses span from compassion to cruelty, often within the same street. As months stretch into years, the pattern becomes clear. The plague is not a storm that passes and leaves sunshine behind it. It is a tide that retreats, then returns stronger or weaker, but always present. Provinces that believe themselves safe discover otherwise when travellers arrive. Soldiers returning from furlough find their households emptied. Merchants return with coin but without families to spend it on. The empire cannot draw neat lines between health and sickness, for commerce and conquest erase those boundaries daily. A Roman wit observes that walls may keep out barbarians but never breathe. The remark, copied centuries later by a monk who likely smirked while writing, captures the futility of barricades against something invisible. Even as the sickness spreads, some cling to superstition with stubborn hope. In Asia, minor priests sacrifice black goats to placate underworld gods. In North Africa, citizens burn heaps of fragrant herbs, choking the streets with perfumed smoke thick enough to sting the eyes. In Gaul, desperate healers prescribe baths in icy rivers, assuring patients that shock will drive out the fever. A quirky anecdote tells of one unfortunate man who leapt into a river in midwinter, only to climb out sicker and angrier, muttering that the gods clearly preferred wine baths. We cannot confirm the tale, but it fits Rome's blend of desperation and irony. Through all of this, the empire's cohesion frays. Supply lines falter because sick workers cannot harvest or transport grain. Tax collectors return with empty purses because villages are emptied. Governors write pleading letters to the Senate demanding aid, though often what they receive is blame instead of supplies. Rumours spread faster than wagons that the emperor has lost divine favour, that a rival faction is poisoning wells, that foreigners have cursed the empire with exotic hexes. Each rumour carries fear in its pocket, and fear is always willing to travel. By the close of this phase, the plague is no longer a rumour whispered in Rome's alleys, but a reality echoed across provinces. Soldiers, merchants, peasants, priests, none are exempt. The empire that once seemed invincible now trembles with coughs and clattering teeth. The story of power meeting its limits spreads alongside the disease, leaving questions that scholars still wrestle with. Was this the plague's natural course, or was it abetted by human folly and suspicion? For those living through it, the answer matters less than survival. By the time the 2nd century reached its height, the memory of the mysterious plague had already been folded into the broader story of Rome's shifting fortunes. Writers of the age treated the pestilence as both calamity and cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most disciplined legions and the most ornate temples could not hold back an invisible threat. They described how city life adjusted, how markets shrank and swelled, depending on rumours of contagion, and how senators debated not only laws but omens. One senator was said to have declared that the plague had struck because too many festivals had been shortened, while another blamed the excess of imported luxuries. Historians still argue whether these speeches were genuine or dramatised after the fact to reinforce a moral. Merchants ever pragmatic discovered that crisis also meant opportunity. Grain ships bound for Ostia carried more than food. They carried stories, gossip, and whispered cures. One trader claimed that fumigating houses with juniper smoke would cleanse the air. Another insisted that amulets inscribed with fragments of Homer's verse could shield a family from illness. Both remedies were eagerly bought, and neither unsurprisingly changed much. Like joke number 1, if Homer could cure plagues, half the city would have been saved by bedtime recitations of the Iliad. Beyond the city, the countryside felt the burden differently. Villages lost farmhands, and estates once busy with harvest became quiet. The state, desperate to keep tax revenues flowing, pressured landowners to maintain output. Some responded by buying up smaller farms and expanding their estates with slave labour. Others abandoned their lands altogether, pushing migration toward the capital. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists later found deserted rural sites where half-finished pottery lay abandoned in kilns, as though the craftsmen simply never returned to finish the firing. Military posts were not spared either. Commanders feared that a sick legion was worse than a defeated one since it carried contagion wherever it marched. Orders circulated to isolate ill soldiers, but without modern understanding of contagion, these quarantines were often too late. Some units weakened so badly that borders once heavily guarded became vulnerable. In one account, a frontier garrison lit multiple campfires to create the illusion of full strength, hoping potential raiders would mistake their numbers. Light joke number 2, it turns out pretending to be stronger is Rome's earliest version of bluffing in poker. Back in Rome itself, religious rituals multiplied. Priests offered sacrifices at every possible altar, hoping to cover all divine bases. Yet even these rituals betrayed political motives. If the plague eased after a certain rite, the priesthood claimed credit and demanded greater influence. If the sickness worsened, blame conveniently shifted to rivals. To ordinary citizens, this constant swirl of rituals and counter-rituals must have looked like divine customer service with too many managers. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies reflected genuine belief, or whether they served mainly as instruments of power. Medical writings from the time add their own curious layer. Galen, the most famous physician of the empire, left descriptions that many later doctors examined with interest. He noted symptoms such as fever, stomach pains, and rashes, but his interpretations leaned heavily on humoral theory imbalances of blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. He recommended bleeding, purging, and diets tailored to the season. Some patients likely recovered by chance, others weakened further. Modern scholars debate whether his accounts match smallpox, measles, or an entirely lost disease. Either way, his notes became foundational for centuries, shaping medieval medicine long after the plague itself had passed. Ordinary people did not always trust physicians, who often charged more than a family could afford. Instead, households turned to herbal remedies and folk traditions. Sprigs of rosemary hung above doors, garlic cloves were strung like protective charms, and baths infused with wine or vinegar promised cleansing power. Quirky tidbit, one recipe suggested grinding crocodile dung with honey, as a poultice proof that desperation occasionally leads to questionable creativity. Light joke number 3. Imagine being sick and realizing your best hope smells like the Nile at low tide. The cultural impact of the plague reached even the arts. Plays staged in the theatre began to include references to pestilence, sometimes as dark warnings, other times as comic relief. Poets wrote verses about love interrupted by sickness, or about the gods testing Rome's resilience. In mosaics, scholars believe certain motifs, skulls, wilting flowers, fading lamps may have carried subtle allusions to the fragility of life. These artistic echoes show how deeply the experience seeped into everyday imagination. Historians still argue whether such motifs were widespread symbols of mortality or simply fashionable embellishments. Meanwhile, Rome's leadership used the crisis to redefine authority. Emperors proclaimed themselves guardians of health, commissioning new aqueduct repairs and sponsoring grain doles. Edicts promised cleaner streets and more organised waste disposal, though results were inconsistent. At times, these gestures soothed the public. At others, they only highlighted how limited imperial power truly was against invisible enemies. One emperor reportedly ordered bonfires lit across the city, claiming the heat would drive away corrupted air. Citizens dutifully piled wood, but skeptics noticed the smoke did more to irritate lungs than to calm fears. By the late 2nd century, the immediate waves of plague began to recede, though outbreaks returned periodically. What lingered most was not the sickness itself, but the memory of vulnerability. The empire that prided itself on legions, roads, and aqueducts had been humbled by something it could neither see nor control. That memory shaped policy, religion, and even personal behaviour for generations. Families told stories of relatives lost, suddenly neighbours who vanished overnight, and children who survived only to carry scars as reminders. These stories became family lore, anchoring the mystery deep in collective memory. Even centuries later, when new generations faced different crises, echoes of the mysterious plague were recalled. Chroniclers compared new outbreaks to the emperor's illness or the shadow pestilence. The label carried both dread and fascination, a shorthand for calamity without clear cause. In that sense, the mystery lived longer than the disease itself, persisting as cultural shorthand whenever uncertainty struck. As Rome continued to evolve, its citizens learned to live with both resilience and suspicion. The memory of the plague became another thread in the tapestry of Roman identity, reminding them that grandeur could stumble, and that even emperors were not immune to unseen forces. With this blend of fear, folklore, and fragile adaptation, the empire marched into its next century still haunted by a silence no physician could fully explain. Centuries later, the mysterious plague still casts its long shadow, not as a living sickness, but as a puzzle that refuses to fade. The empire that once commanded continents eventually crumbled into memory, yet the stories of that silent killer travelled onward through chronicles, legends, and whispered tales. Scholars sit in lecture halls, their voices calm, but their words restless, circling around the same unanswered question: how could the most powerful man-made system of its age be shaken so deeply by a force so invisible? Historians still argue whether it was sudden cardiac arrest, smallpox, measles, lead poisoning, or an assassin's concoction slipped into wine. But every theory leaves behind loose threads, and those threads weave together into a tapestry more about mystery than medicine. In the modern world, science attempts to reassemble fragments of the past. Archaeologists scrape soil near ruins, testing for chemical traces that might betray poisons or pathogens. Physicians compare ancient texts with case studies of known diseases, measuring fevers and rashes against today's vocabulary of diagnosis. Quirky tidbit, one team even floated the idea of analysing cremation urns for residual toxins, a project so ambitious it bordered on wishful alchemy. Yet despite these efforts, the evidence refuses to yield its final secret. Light joke number 1, the Emperor may have the rare distinction of frustrating both Roman senators and 21st century lab technicians equally. Beyond academia, the story has grown into cultural myth. Novels, documentaries, and even late-night podcasts retell the tale with their own spins, some grim, some playful, all fascinated by the silent end that left no mark. Children in modern classrooms still reenact the drama, scribbling in notebooks, as if they were ancient scribes inventing yet another contradictory scroll. The Emperor who once sought power over men now wields power over imaginations, a kind of immortality few rulers ever achieve. Historians still argue whether his memory endures because of the mystery itself, or because humans love a riddle more than an answer. The persistence of the story also reflects something deeper: the fragility of order. Rome built aqueducts that stretched for tens of kilometres, amphitheatres that seated 50,000, and armies that carried its banners across the known world. Yet all of it could wobble when a single life ended suddenly without warning or explanation. The Emperor's death and the plague's shadow reminded Romans and now us that power rests on fragile foundations. Like joke number 2, for all their engineering genius, they never figured out how to build an aqueduct to carry certainty. As centuries passed, the mystery adapted to the anxieties of each era. Medieval monks wrote of curses and divine justice. Renaissance thinkers reframed the story as a lesson on tyranny and fate. 19th century pamphlets insisted on arsenic because political murders were fashionable in their time, and today the story thrives in documentaries and YouTube videos alike, stitched into the wider fascination with unsolved history. Each retelling is less about the Emperor and more about the storytellers projecting their fears, their morals, and their curiosities onto a silence that cannot answer back. The Emperor himself, if he could hear these endless debates, might have found the spectacle amusing. Perhaps he would laugh at the idea of powdered diamonds slipped into his stew, or shake his head at the notion of divine lightning indoors. Like joke number 3, he might even mutter, "I was just tired, what's all the fuss?" But history does not bend to the testimony of the dead, and so the silence remains unbroken. What matters now is not the final diagnosis, but the way the mystery binds past and present. It reminds us that even the grandest civilizations are vulnerable, that certainty is a luxury, and that stories often outlast stone. His death without a mark became less an ending than an opening, an invitation for centuries of voices to speculate, argue, and wonder. And perhaps that is its true legacy, not proof of poison or disease, but proof of humanity's refusal to let unanswered questions slip quietly away. And now the pace softens. The tale has carried us through marble corridors, across crowded forums, into temples, heavy with smoke, and into the hushed silence of a chamber where a mystery still lies. But here at the close of the story, the voices grow quieter. The senators stop whispering, the soldiers stop pacing, and even the scholars close their books for the night. Picture Rome at rest. The markets are empty, their stalls folded away. The Tiber flows steady beneath stone bridges, reflecting the pale shimmer of the moon. In courtyards, lamps burn low until only faint embers glow. The palace itself, so full of noise and suspicion by day, now lies hushed its walls, holding only the calm of sleep. The Emperor's shadow lingers, but tonight it feels less menacing and more like a faint memory stretched thin by time. The questions remain poison, or heartache, curse, or chance, but the urgency fades. What once shook an empire now drifts into the quiet rhythm of story a tale meant not to trouble but to soothe. So breathe slowly, evenly, as though your own heart is matching the steady flow of the river. Let the marble columns dissolve into the darkness. Let the torches gutter out. Let the city itself become still beneath the stars. The mystery will wait for another day, another historian, another curious listener. For now, all that is required is rest. May your dreams be calm, your thoughts unburdened, and your sleep as soft as Rome beneath the night sky.